Hi, ladies. Welcome back for part two of the Vietnam War. And so we're going to pick up where we left off. Um, and we kind of talked a little bit about last time the type of warfare that soldiers had encountered during um, Vietnam. And part of the issue, or I should say, the challenges that they faced um, were that the Vietnamese people, whether it's Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese, didn't give up very easily, and so we saw the system of um, tunnels that were used. So it really creates a stalemate for this war, and this happens to go on for a few years. What changes is what takes place in 1968, which is known as the Tet Offensive, and Tet um, TET is referring to the Vietnamese New Year. So this is a big holiday, kind of similar to like the Chinese New Year. So this is like the big holiday that the Vietnamese people celebrate. And this was a time when Americans kind of took for granted that, thinking, okay, well, this is like a holiday, that this is sort of going to be a quiet time. And actually, the Viet Cong takes advantage of this period of time and launches a big surprise attack on many of the major cities and towns and military bases that the Americans held. So it was a turning point in the war for them. I might have said this last time, kind of spoiler, but we don't win the Vietnam War. Um, and so this was extremely brutal. This was a time when the Viet Cong really had no mercy for anyone who was considered a sympathizer to the U.S. or maybe potentially, if they were suspicious that they were working along with us in any way, they were labeled the enemy, and there were no, again, no holds bars, no prisoners type of thing. So this was not good for the U.S. 1968 was a pretty harsh year for the United States in general. It was a pretty violent year. Here in the U.S., we have just a lot of upheaval at the time. And it's a year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, was assassinated, and just a lot of upheaval that we'll kind of look at a little bit later. Part of it has to do with these anti-war movements. And the Vietnam War is a very, very controversial war. It's known as the Living Room War because it's the first time that Americans could actually see what's happening on a daily basis because of television and specifically the evening news. So they were seeing images really live as they were happening. And the protesting and like the anti-war movement really starts at the university level. So, students not much older than you who were who had, some of them attended what are called teach-ins, which these are like lectures and discussions by professors and sort of like this seeming with like an anti-war message. And you'll see in the video that you're going to watch in Vietnam in HD, it's actually in the very opening credits of the differences between the greatest generation and these older set of baby boomers who do not see eye to eye. And their argument is that this is not like World War II. It's very different. One of the fueling factors for the anti-war side of the protests was draft resistance. So the Selective Service Act, which by now you guys know that vocab term because it started in World War I. We saw it in World War II. We're going to see it again in Vietnam and also Korea. So this is the draft, and so the draft was enacted once again. Except this time was different. We had a lot of young men who will oppose the draft. I shouldn't say a lot, but I should say like a significant number, way more than any other war in previous. And so men who objected to being drafted, some were are called draft dodgers. So these are young men at the time who will cross the border into Canada. Some of those that are of a wealthier lifestyle, so to speak, will be sent off to like school abroad. I mean, there were kind of ways around this for not sending or not going to the call of the draft. Some were called conscientious objectors, and conscientious objectors, not something that we've necessarily seen that's new in terms of trying to get out of the draft. Basically, a conscientious objector is someone who has a very specific religious or moral belief that they're not able to fight in a war. And it's pretty rare. I mean, we saw it in previous wars. It doesn't mean that you get out of military service. They just usually put you in an area where you're not like on the front line. So you may do like desk work or something like that. But during Vietnam, we see a high number of those that try to apply for conscientious objector status. And it's a really it's pretty hard to prove. So you can imagine, I mean, you could just say, well, of course, like my religious beliefs don't, that I don't want to go to war because of my religious beliefs, but you had to actually like prove that was part of your religion or your morality. In 1965, as I mentioned before, Johnson will continue to increase the numbers of draftees and those that are going into Vietnam. And this is very controversial. And so a lot of Americans begin to question what's happening, to question really the fairness of the war. And as these the last few years of the 1960s into the 70s, it's pretty tense here in the U.S. I know that, you guys keep up with news of what's going on. You've seen so the protests right now in Michigan and Illinois, actually here in Columbus and Ohio, against sort of like what's happening now. And that's, controversial, although protesting is legal. It's legal. It's part of your First Amendment rights. So kind of look at that, but like magnifying that by 100 times more. You see anti-war protests back in the 60s, sort of all over the place. So resistance to the draft will grow. Some will claim physical disabilities, like I can't go because of this, and try to fail the medical or psychological exams that are given. There were about 100,000 that flee the country, and that's actually against the law. So if you're a draft dodger, you can face up to 10 years in prison and a $10,000, I think it's $10,000 back then, $10,000 fine. So the election of 1968 becomes a pretty important election in the history of presidential elections. And that's because Johnson, so President Johnson, who again is the vice president for Kennedy, who takes over the office when Kennedy's assassinated. So he'd been the president about 5 years at this point. He does not seek re-election because of the really the mass amount of people that were sort of against what he was doing. He did not have a lot of support. He actually was pretty far down in the polls, and he doesn't seek re-election because of the war. So in 1968, the nation chooses Richard Nixon, who's the Republican candidate for president. And he will boast during his campaign a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. He doesn't, kind of like when FDR ran in 1932, like this idea of a New Deal, but doesn't really specify what that is. Nixon, in some ways, says sort of the same thing. I've got a plan that we're going to end the war in Vietnam. If you remember, Nixon, I mentioned last time, was the vice president to Eisenhower during the 50s, loses in 1960 to JFK, and then comes back and runs and successfully wins in 68. But of course, he's reelected in 72, will end up resigning from office in 1974 due to the Watergate scandal. And he's the only president that will end up resigning from office. So he announces this new policy about Vietnam, and he calls it Vietnamization. And basically, he says we don't really need to have as much American forces there as long as we are replacing them with South Vietnamese soldiers. So our focus should be on training those soldiers. He also calls the slow removal of troops Peace with Honor, which is actually the last episode of Vietnam in HD, which if I can get part of the copy of that last episode to you, we're not going to watch the whole thing, but I might have you watch that last, like, I don't know, 15 minutes or so, because it's kind of interesting how that all takes place. But anyway, so it's a way to try to appease the American public. So the call for the end of the war and the call for the U.S. to get out, but not actually saying that we lost the war, even though we are, but not to actually say like, oh, well, we've lost the war and we're going to just end it. It was a plan to maintain U.S. dignity. Now, the problem with Nixon's Vietnamization plan is that as he is saying this, you see this picture of him here on, see, I got to get my pen out again. I don't have much to like highlight this time. So yeah, you see, yeah, okay. I don't know why I like that. It's just kind of fun. So as he is addressing the American people on network television and saying that we're going to start removing U.S. soldiers, he's pretty tricky. Actually, his nickname was Tricky Dick, so you understand where he gets this nickname from. He in the White House was actually expanding the U.S. role because we invade Laos and Cambodia kind of at the same time this is happening. So he loses some credibility with the U.S. people as well, because he's like telling us one thing, but he's actually doing something opposite behind the scenes. And so that doesn't go over very well with the American people. Okay, so just like last time, I forgot how to get my cursor back. I don't know. Let's see if this works. Okay, there we go. Got it. All right. So as this is happening, so on one hand is we are on one side trying to end it, but yet we've moved into these other two little countries to try to like prevent the spread of communism. We're also involved in the Paris peace talks, which is an ongoing thing. And it actually like takes, I don't know, over a year or so to really get these talks going and like have some finality to it. In 1973, the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong all signed this peace treaty in Paris. And the terms that they sign is for the U.S. to withdraw all their forces within 60 days. Prisoners of war would be released. And this is really important because the Vietnam War, we see a lot of prisoners of war. So those are soldiers that are taken by the other side. And we had a number of prisoners of war. If those of you that are familiar with who John McCain is, he passed away about a year and a half ago, but he was a senator from Arizona. He ran for president in 2008 against Barack Obama, and he's probably one of our most famous POWs. He served, I think he was in the Air Force, and his plane went down. He was taken as a prisoner of war by the Viet Cong and was kept there for 5 years. 5 years he was held as a prisoner of war and just tortured beyond belief. And so and like others who many of them were prisoners of war for years. So you think about like that time frame, how horrible that would be. Agreeing to ending military activities in Laos and Cambodia and having the 17th parallel continue to divide North and South. So kind of going back to like how it started, basically, because there was no stopping of communism. There was no like taking over the North and unifying it with the South under a democratic government. There wasn't any of these like objectives that we started out with, really. But, you know, just at this point, it was just kind of looking at how we can end that war. So even though we do stop, okay, so in 1973, But those like 2.5 years that Nixon's in office, it starts to like increase in terms of involvement, and then kind of like a backslide into decreasing. And we do withdraw most of our combat troops, although we do have Americans and Marines in Saigon. Saigon at that time was the capital of South Vietnam. And at this point, like by 1975, sort of like the headlines about Vietnam sort of kind of fade away from the headlines, and we see really not much that the U.S. can do, because the North doesn't really abide by anything that they agreed to, and they actually increase things that are happening in the North, and they have a plan of attack to take over Saigon. And there's nothing that the U.S. can do because Congress won't fund Vietnam War anymore. And so we're basically, the U.S. government gave Americans in Saigon and those South Vietnamese people, less than 24 hours to evacuate the city because communist forces were coming in. This happened, it's been almost 45 years ago last week that we carry out this dramatic evacuation. So there are over 1,000 Americans that are airlifted and nearly 6,000 Vietnamese. It's a really poignant and sad video to see, or film to see, the last helicopter that leaves Saigon. And you see in this picture all of the people that were in line. We couldn't take them. There were only so many that we could take. The U.S. had aircraft carriers sitting out, I think near like the Gulf of Tonkin, South China Sea area, and they were actually pushing off planes and helicopters into the ocean to make more room to bring as many South Vietnamese people as we could, because we were afraid of what the North Vietnamese would do to these people that worked with the U.S. government. And so we tried to get out as many as we could. Again, if I can get that footage uploaded, I'll show that to you towards the end of the week, because I think it's a really poignant thing to see, and to see that sort of come to, I don't want to say an abrupt end. It was just this like dragged out. If you think of like the years, we're pretty much involved in Vietnam for like 12 years. And it kind of comes to this close where we not only lose, but Vietnam is then reunited under communism, and it still is today. So in all, we lose 58,000 Americans and over 300,000 prisoners of war and MIAs, which are missing in action. So there are still a handful of men who we have never found. We don't know what happened to them, and they've never been accounted for. And unfortunately, those families have gone on to never know like what had happened to their loved ones. This is the longest and least successful war in U.S. history. And unfortunately for the soldiers and the veterans, it's quite a different reception that they receive upon coming home than in World War II. One of the biggest lessons that we can learn from Vietnam is the way that we treat soldiers, because during that time of tension and protesting and anti-war feelings, a lot of soldiers coming home were often like spit on, yelled at, attacked verbally and physically. It was a really, really shameful time. And we see, if you study more in depth what happens in this war and what these soldiers witness and what they go through, it was really psychologically devastating. So I had said when I had uploaded, or when I had posted about what you guys were going to be doing this week, if you maybe know of a Vietnam vet in your family, and maybe you don't know that you have one, because it's a very different type of people. And again, if I can get the other video for you guys, I think we would watch it in class, because I have it on DVD, but of course I can't show it to you through that. So it's a great thing to see, I think, how these veterans have reacted, and really in recent years, now that most of them are, over the age of like at least 65, how they've come to terms with their time over there and what they have learned throughout that. So our lessons are that we appreciate those that serve in our military. We know that we do as much as we can to support our soldiers, because, it's not the soldiers' fault. We can disagree with what the government does and the decisions that the government makes, but those that serve in the military are serving us and serving the government. And, they're not there to like say, no, I'm not going to go do that. They go and they go and they serve, and they do that, without opposition. So we don't mistake our opposition for their sacrifice. Some of you that have been to Washington, D.C. may have gone to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. This was built in 1982, and it was to honor those that were killed. Vietnam, again, like I said, reunites under communist rule. We don't have any diplomatic relations with Vietnam until 1995. It takes 20 years for us to have any type of relationship with them. We've since had, an okay relationship with the U.S. or with Vietnam and the U.S. We do trade with them, and things have been pretty calm and steady since then. These are just some pictures of the wall in Washington, D.C., and these list all of those that lost their life or are missing in action from the war. So you see a lot of people visit the wall, many families that will come and look for the name of their loved ones. It's a very moving and touching tribute and memorial, and it's almost kind of like, it's not a mirror, but it has that reflection in the stone that, it's just a very pretty and moving tribute. So that ends our notes for Vietnam. I feel like we kind of went over this very fast. We're not spending as much time on it than we normally do, but if you have any questions or you want to go over anything, I will be happy to answer them, and I will see you guys soon.